Close your eyes and let the currents of history carry you back to a time of marble and moonlight, of empire and echo. This is not merely a tale of conquest or collapse, but a quiet meditation on the rise and fall of Rome, whispered like a lullaby. Picture the Tiber River, winding through the heart of the eternal city, its waters reflecting the glow of 1,000 lamps. Here, beneath the arches of the Forum and the shadow of the Pantheon, a civilization once thrived, grand yet fragile, mighty yet mortal. Its story is not one of sudden ruin, but of slow tides, shifting like sand beneath the weight of time. We will walk its streets together, from the golden age of bustling markets to the hushed twilight of its final emperors. There will be triumphs and trials, innovations and quiet unravelings, each chapter a stepping stone across the centuries. But fear not, this is not a story to unsettle. Let it unfold like a dream, soft as the rustle of papyrus, steady as the rhythm of a distant legion's march. If the journey lingers with you, if the whispers of Rome lull you into deeper rest, consider returning for more tales spun gently for sleep. For now, let the past cradle you. Breathe in, breathe out, and drift into the age of empires. The story begins. The sun rises over Rome, gilding the marble columns of the Forum in honeyed light. The air hums with the quiet industry of a city unaware of the storms to come, a city at the height of its power. Here, in the heart of the empire, every stone tells a story of triumph. The Pantheon's dome stretches toward the heavens, a perfect circle open to the gods, while the Colosseum stands silent in the morning mist, its arches holding echoes of roaring crowds and the clash of gladiators. The streets awaken slowly. Merchants arrange their wares, olives from Hispania, silks from the east, spices that scent the air with cinnamon and myrrh. The cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, led to bustling squares where citizens gather, their voices a murmur beneath the cry of gulls circling the Tiber. Senators in white togas stride past, their conversations laced with politics and philosophy, while laborers haul amphorae of wine toward the insulae, the towering apartments where smoke curls from communal hearths. Beyond the city's core, the Palatine Hill rises, crowned with the villas of the patricians. Their gardens spill over with roses and ivy, their mosaics glinting in the sun. Here, the elite recline in shaded courtyards, sipping Falernian wine as slaves fan them with peacock feathers. Yet even in this opulence, there is order, a rhythm as steady as the aqueducts that channel mountain springs into fountains and baths. Rome thrives on this balance, the grandeur of its monuments and the simplicity of its daily rituals. Bread bakes in communal ovens, children chase hoops through alleyways, priests tend the sacred flames of Vesta. The empire stretches from Britannia to Syria, but here, in this moment, it feels eternal. But eternity is a fleeting thing. Far beyond the city walls, beyond the Alps and the Rhine, the wind carries whispers, faint for now, of shifting borders and restless tribes. The roads that bind the empire, smooth and straight as arrows, will one day carry more than trade and tribute. Yet today, Rome dreams on, bathed in golden light, its people moving through their lives like figures in a fresco. Vivid, untouchable, and unaware. Sleep lingers at the edges of this vision. Let it pull you deeper into the murmur of markets and the shadow of monuments. The story is only beginning. The markets of Rome breathe like a living thing, their rhythms steady as a heartbeat. Beneath the awnings of Trajan's market, the air is thick with the scent of freshly baked bread, ripe figs, and the tang of fish sauce from distant ports. Vendors call out in melodic cadence, their voices weaving through the crowd, a tapestry of Latin, Greek, and the occasional barbarian tongue. Coins change hands, glinting bronze and silver, their edges worn smooth by countless transactions. A spice merchant pours saffron onto a bronze scale, its threads like filaments of sunlight. Nearby, a potter arranges his wares, terracotta lamps adorned with gods and beasts, their hollow bellies waiting for oil and flame. The shoppers move in unhurried waves, patricians in finely draped stolas brushing past plebeians in simple tunics, their baskets laden with olives and cheese. A slave boy darts through the throng, balancing a tray of honeyed pastries, their sweetness clinging to the warm air. Beyond the market, the cultural pulse of Rome quickens. In the shadow of the theatre of Pompey, actors rehearse lines from Plautus, their exaggerated gestures drawing laughter from a cluster of onlookers. A poet recites verses near the baths of Agrippa, his words dissolving into the mist rising from the heated pools. Music drifts from an open courtyard, the pluck of a lyre, the soft beat of a tambourine. As dancers sway, their movements as fluid as the Tiber's current. In the Suburra, the city's vibrant underbelly, life is louder, messier. Taverns spill laughter into narrow alleys, their walls stained with wine and candle smoke. Craftsmen hammer at bronze and leather, their workshops spilling onto the streets. Here, the divide between rich and poor softens. A senator's son might lose himself in a dice game beside a freedman, both united by the thrill of chance. Yet even in this golden age, there are cracks, subtle as the veins in marble. The grain dole lines stretch longer some days, and whispers pass between merchants of rising prices, of ships delayed by storms or pirates. In the forum, a philosopher debates the nature of empire, his voice low but insistent. Nothing built by man lasts forever. The crowd nods, then disperses, the thought dissolving like salt in wine. For now, Rome is a symphony, a city of laughter and labor, of gods and bread, and the quiet turning of the hours. The sun dips toward the Capitoline Hill, gilding the rooftops, and the first stars appear like distant watchmen. The baths grow crowded, the libraries hum with murmured debate, and the night's revelries begin. Sleep wraps around the city, gentle as a cloak. Let it wrap around you too, as the story of Rome unfolds, one whispered detail at a time. Tomorrow the empire will wake again, and so will we. But for now, rest. The strength of Rome did not rise from marble alone, nor from the flash of a legion's shield. It was built on quieter things, on stone and water, on ink and order. The empire stood upon pillars unseen but unshakable, each one a testament to the ingenuity of its people. First, the roads. They stretched like sinews across the land, straight and unyielding, from the misty hills of Britannia to the sun-baked ports of Africa. Built by the hands of soldiers and slaves, these were no mere paths but lifelines, paved with volcanic rock and packed gravel, designed to outlast the centuries. A messenger could gallop from Rome to the Rhine in days, his horse's hooves drumming a steady rhythm on the flawless surface. Trade carts rolled ceaselessly, bearing olive oil from Hispania, glass from Syria, and the shimmering marble that would become another temple, another forum. The roads bound the empire together, until one day they would carry more than merchants and missives. But for now, they hummed with purpose, veins pumping life into the body of Rome. Then the water. The aqueducts arched across the countryside, their soaring bridges defying gravity, their channels a miracle of precision. From mountain springs to city fountains, the water flowed uninterrupted, clean and cold. It filled the baths where senators soaked and gossiped, fed the gardens of the wealthy, and quenched the thirst of 1 million souls. In the shadow of the Aqua Claudia, children played, their laughter echoing beneath the arches, while engineers measured the gradient with bronze levels, ensuring not a drop was wasted. Rome's genius was not just in conquest, but in care, in knowing that a civilization thrives when its people drink deeply. And last, the laws. Carved into bronze and recited in the Forum, they were the invisible threads that held the chaos of empire at bay. Let justice be done, the magistrates intoned, settling disputes between merchant and farmer, citizen and foreigner. The 12 tables, ancient and unadorned, stood as a promise that even the mightiest could be called to account. A freedman knew his rights, a widow could appeal to the courts. The law was not perfect, but it was steadfast, a shield for the weak, a check on the powerful, yet even pillars bear weight. The roads, so vital, required endless repair, their stones loosening under the tread of time. The aqueducts, so grand, begged for constant tending, their channels silting with neglect when coffers ran low. And the laws, so noble, could bend beneath the whims of emperors, their fairness fraying like the edges of a scroll. But in this moment, Rome did not waver. The roads still ran straight, the water still flowed, the courts still convened. The empire stood firm, its foundations unshaken. Sleep lingers at the edges of this vision, where stone meets sky and order reigns. Let it carry you, as steady as the march of a legion, as sure as the course of an aqueduct. The story is far from over. Rest now, the pillars will hold. The legions were the silent heartbeat of Rome, disciplined, unyielding, a force that stretched across 3 continents. Beneath the crimson banners of the Aquila, they stood shoulder to shoulder, their armor glinting like a river of iron under the sun. Each soldier was a thread in the empire's vast tapestry, bound by oath and loyalty to something greater than himself. At dawn, the camp stirred to life. The centurion's whistle cut through the mist, and the men rose as one, their movements precise even in the half-light. They mended armor, honed blades, and scrubbed the leather of their sandals with oil and ash. Breakfast was simple: hardtack, cheese, and sour wine, swallowed quickly before the day's drills began. There was no wasted motion, no idle chatter, only the quiet efficiency of men who knew their duty. On the parade ground, they moved as a single beast. The testudo formation locked into place, shields overlapping like the scales of a dragon, impervious to arrows. Pilums flew in perfect arcs, their weighted tips driving deep into straw dummies. Every step, every strike was measured, rehearsed 1,000 times until it became instinct. This was Rome's strength, not just in the might of its arms, but in the harmony of its ranks. Yet the legions were more than war machines. They built as much as they conquered, laying roads, raising forts, bridging rivers with timber and sweat. A soldier was a mason, an engineer, a diplomat. In the far-flung provinces, he policed trade routes, mediated tribal disputes, and carried the Pax Romana like a torch into the wilderness. The locals might grumble at taxes, but they slept soundly, knowing wolves and bandits would not trouble their villages. But loyalty, even the fiercest, has its limits. As the empire aged, the legions grew restless. A general acclaimed by his troops might march on Rome itself, his ambition fed by their devotion. Emperors rose and fell at the point of a sword, their fates decided not in the Senate, but in the mud of some distant garrison. And the soldiers, once the shield of the people, sometimes became their burden, demanding bonuses, land, privileges that drained the treasury dry. Still, in the golden years, the legions held firm. They stood watch on Hadrian's wall, where the wind carried the scent of heather and the cries of northern tribes. They patrolled the deserts of Syria, where the sand whispered of Parthian arrows and forgotten kingdoms. They were Rome's promise. That order would prevail, that the world would bend to the will of the eagle. But promises, like empires, are mortal. Beyond the frontiers, the forests rustled with movement, the rivers swelled with strange boats, the roads, so carefully built, began to carry footsteps that did not march in time with Rome's drum. For now, though, the watchfires burned bright. The sentries peered into the night, their breath steady, their hands firm on their spears. The empire endured, upheld by the men who served it, not as conquerors, but as guardians. Sleep wraps around them, as it wraps around you. The story is not over, but the sentinels keep their vigil. Rest while the pillars still stand. The heart of Rome was not only in its marble monuments or bustling forums, but in the quiet rhythm of its homes, where the scent of baking bread mingled with the murmur of family voices, where oil lamps flickered against frescoed walls as evening fell. In the shadow of the Palatine, the patrician villas sprawled like miniature palaces. Their atriums welcomed guests with the gentle splash of impluvium fountains, catching rainwater in shallow pools. Mosaics of dolphins and gods adorned the floors, their colors softened by centuries of footsteps. Here, the matron of the house directed slaves with a whisper, freshening the rose petals strewn across dining couches, ensuring the wine was watered just so. Children practiced their letters on wax tablets under the watchful gaze of a Greek tutor, while in the garden a philosopher and a senator debated stoicism, their voices low beneath the rustle of laurel leaves. Beyond the wealthy quarters, the insulae rose like honeycombs, their wooden balconies sagging under the weight of daily life. In these cramped apartments, families shared thin walls with bakers, weavers, and scribes. The air hummed with the smell of frying fish and the tang of fermenting garum from the shop below. A mother rocked her child to sleep, singing an old Etruscan lullaby as her husband mended a fishing net by lamplight. Through the open window drifted the sounds of the city, a drunkard's laughter, a night watchman's call, the distant strum of a lyre from a tavern down the street. Dinner was a sacred hour, even for the poor. A labourer might savour a simple meal of spelt porridge with leeks, while a merchant's family feasted on dormice glazed in honey and mullet stuffed with herbs. The act of sharing food was a ritual, a momentary pause in the rush of days. Slaves, some born in Rome, others captured from distant wars, moved silently between tables, their presence as much a part of the household as the furniture. Yet in quieter moments, bonds formed. A nurse soothing a homesick Thracian child, a cook teaching a young master to roll pastry dough. The streets outside grew still as midnight approached, but within the homes, life pulsed softly. A grandmother told stories of the old republic to wide-eyed grandchildren, her voice weaving tales of Cincinnatus and his plough. A young couple whispered beneath a shared blanket, their dreams as fragile as the clay lamp guttering beside them. Rome was more than conquest and glory. It was the warmth of a hearth, the weight of a child's head nodding against a shoulder, the quiet pride of a craftsman's hands shaping clay into something lasting. But even in this tranquility, shadows lingered. The insula's wooden beams, dry as tinder, could blaze into catastrophe with a single spark. The slave who laughed today might weep tomorrow, sold away to a harsher master. And the taxes that paid for the city's splendor weighed heavier each year on the shoulders of the poor. For now, though, the night was kind. The oil lamps burned low and the eternal city exhaled, its people dreaming beneath the same stars that had watched over Romulus and Remus. Sleep wraps around them as it does around you. Let the murmur of history carry you deeper. Tomorrow, the festivals will begin. But tonight, rest. The story continues. The festivals of Rome were a symphony of color and sound, a fleeting respite from the toil of daily life. When the trumpets announced the Ludi Romani, the city exhaled in collective joy, its streets transformed into a river of garlands and laughter. At dawn, the procession began. Priests in white robes led the way, swinging censers of myrrh that curled into the morning air. Behind them came the statues of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, borne aloft on litters by barefoot acolytes, their marble faces serene above the crowd. Children darted between legs, clutching honey cakes stolen from vendors' stalls, their sticky fingers leaving trails on tunics. The scent of roasting meat drifted from the public kitchens, where whole oxen turned on spits, their fat hissing into the coals. In the Circus Maximus, the crowd roared as one, charioteers in the colors of their factions, the reds, the blues, the greens, lashed their teams around the spina, their wheels throwing up sprays of sand. The horses' nostrils flared, their muscles gleaming with sweat as they thundered past, so close the spectators could feel the wind of their passing. Bets were exchanged, curses and cheers tangled in the air, and for a few breathless hours, senator and slave stood shoulder to shoulder, united by the thrill of the race. The theatres offered quieter magic. Beneath the open sky, actors donned masks of comedy and tragedy, their voices swelling to reach the highest tiers. The plays of Plautus sent ripples of laughter through the crowd, while the tragedies of Seneca drew hushed silence. Stories of gods and mortals, love and betrayal, as old as the hills of Latium. A young girl, perched on her father's shoulders, watched wide-eyed as Medea vowed her revenge, her painted mask twisting in the torchlight. By dusk, the city softened. In the forum, musicians plucked lyres and flutes, their melodies winding through the colonnades. Dancers from Alexandria spun on makeshift stages, their veils fluttering like moth wings, their ankles ringed with silver bells. Fire-eaters and acrobats performed for tossed coins, their bodies bending in impossible arcs. The wine flowed freely, poured from clay jugs into cups, shared between friends and strangers alike. Yet even in celebration, the divisions lingered. The patricians retreated to private gardens, where poets recited verses beneath imported silk canopies, and the wine was chilled with snow from the Apennines. Meanwhile, in the Subura, the poor made their own merriment, singing bawdy songs, clapping along to the beat of a dented tambourine. A beggar with a lyre strummed a tune about lost love, and for a moment even the hard-faced matrons paused to listen. The night deepened. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies along the Tiber, their reflections shimmering in the dark water. Lovers stole kisses in the shadow of temples. Old men dozed against pillars, their heads nodding to the distant hum of music. The festivals were a gift, a reminder that joy, however fleeting, was woven into the fabric of Rome. But gifts come at a cost. The grain dole had been doubled for the occasion, emptying storehouses already strained by bad harvests. The charioteers' rivalries sometimes spilled into riots, their fans clashing in alleyways with fists and knives. And the slaves who served the feasts would return, exhausted, to cramped quarters, their laughter fading with the embers of the feast. For now, though, the city dreamed in wine and torchlight. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched 1,000 such nights before. Sleep wraps around you as it wrapped around Rome. Tomorrow the streets will be swept clean, the routines resumed. But tonight, let the echo of cymbals and song linger in your dreams. The story goes on. From the mist-wrapped hills of Britannia to the sun-scorched banks of the Nile, Rome's dominion stretched like a vast, sheltering cloak. The empire was not a single city, but a constellation of provinces, each bound to the heart by threads of road and law, trade and tribute. In the far north, where the wind carried the salt tang of the ocean, the legionaries of Hadrian's wall stamped their feet against the chill. The stone barrier cut across the land like a scar, its watchtowers standing sentinel over moors where the Picts moved like shadows in the heather. The soldiers here were a world away from Rome's sunlit forums, their breath fogging the air as they traded coarse jokes, their palisades bristling with sharpened stakes. Yet even here, the empire's touch was felt. Amphorae of Spanish olive oil sat beside local mead in the fort storerooms, and a centurion's wife wrote letters home on thin sheets of wax, her Latin curling around Celtic place names. Southward, the roads unfurled through Gaul, where vineyards clung to rolling hills and the towns bore the orderly stamp of Roman planners. In Lugdunum, the marketplace buzzed with the chatter of a dozen tongues, Gallic traders haggling over wool, Syrian merchants unpacking spices, German auxiliaries off duty, their accents rough but their Latin serviceable. The children of veterans played legion and barbarian in the streets, their wooden swords clacking against shields made of woven reeds. And then the sea. At Massilia, the Mediterranean stretched sapphire to the horizon, its waves bearing ships laden with Egyptian grain, Greek marble, and African ivory. The docks groaned under the weight of cargo. Sailors shouted in Phoenician and Punic as they unloaded crates stamped with the imperial seal. A customs officer tallied the goods, his stylus scratching against a wax tablet, while a stray cat licked fish scales from the stones. But it was in the east that Rome's grandeur met older splendors. Antioch's colonnades echoed with the footsteps of philosophers and silk-robed diplomats, its libraries holding scrolls from as far as India. The city was a crossroads, where Roman pragmatism blended with Persian luxury, where a soldier might pray to Mithras at dawn and attend a lecture on Plato by noon. Beyond it lay the deserts of Syria, where camel caravans wound toward Palmyra, their loads of incense and myrrh destined for the altars of Rome. And then Egypt. The Nile's annual flood painted the land emerald, its waters feeding fields that filled the empire's granaries. In Alexandria, the lighthouse's flame pierced the night, guiding ships into a harbor where Cleopatra's palaces had once glittered. Scholars pored over texts in the great library, their debates as much a part of the city's life as the fishermen hauling nets at dawn. The past was alive here, in the hieroglyphs of temple walls, in the mummies sealed with golden masks, in the quiet persistence of gods who had outlasted pharaohs. Yet for all its reach, the empire was not infinite. The roads that carried grain also carried whispers of unrest in the mountains of Dacia, of Parthian arrows testing the Euphrates borders. The legions were stretched thin, their loyalty sometimes swaying with the promise of a rival's gold. And the provinces, though Roman in name, kept their own hearts. The Druids of Britannia still murmured in sacred groves, The priests of Isis still drew crowds in Pompeii's backstreets. For now, though, the Pax Romana held. The ships sailed, the taxes were collected, the governors ruled in the emperor's name. From the damp forests of Germania to the dunes of Libya, the world moved to Rome's rhythm, a rhythm as steady as a marching drum, as deep as the Nile's current. Sleep wraps around these distant lands as it wraps around you. The empire dreams beneath 1,000 different stars, each one a silent witness to its span. Rest now, the map is vast, but the story is not done. The provinces breathed life into Rome's body, their goods and ideas flowing along the empire's veins like blood. In the markets of Ostia, the docks groaned under the weight of Egyptian grain, its golden kernels pouring into the city's storerooms to feed the masses. From Hispania came olive oil, dark and rich, sealed in clay amphorae stamped with merchant marks. British tin and Gallic glass mingled on warehouse shelves, while Syrian silk shimmered like liquid moonlight in the hands of patrician buyers. But trade carried more than goods, it carried words. Greek physicians debated remedies in the shadow of the Aventine, their scrolls filled with knowledge from Alexandria's halls. Eastern cults whispered through Rome's backstreets, their altars fragrant with foreign incense. A soldier returning from Judea might speak of a crucified prophet, while a merchant from Carthage sang Phoenician lullabies to his Roman-born children. The empire absorbed these fragments like a sponge, weaving them into its own tapestry. In the forum of a provincial town, perhaps Lugdunum or Corinth, a Roman magistrate settled disputes between locals with patient pragmatism. The law was Latin, but the faces before him were Gallic, Greek, Numidian. A weaver presented a contract in halting Latin. A farmer swore by his local god before giving testimony. The verdicts carved into wax would be enforced by legionaries from Dalmatia or Thrace, their accents thick, but their loyalty unwavering. Rome ruled not by erasing differences, but by making them irrelevant to the business of order. The roads bore scholars too. A philosopher from Athens might lecture in Marseille, his students scribbling notes in Greek while the sea breeze ruffled their parchments. In Corduba, the poet Martial sharpened his wit on local gossip, his verses mocking senators and slaves alike. And everywhere, the engineers, surveying aqueducts in Africa, repairing bridges in Moesia, shared their craft with apprentices from a dozen tribes. Knowledge, like the coins in a merchant's purse, passed freely from hand to hand. Yet this exchange was not without strain. The grain ships from Egypt were the empire's lifeline, but a storm or a pirate raid could send prices soaring in Rome's markets. The Silk Road stretched all the way to China, but each caravan that crossed Parthian lands paid tolls in silver, silver that Rome's mines struggled to keep in supply. And the very roads that spread Roman culture also carried news of unrest. A tax revolt in Gaul, a governor's corruption in Asia Minor, the restless stirring of tribes beyond the Rhine. For now, though, the balance held. In a Londinium workshop, a Celtic artisan crafted brooches in the Roman style, his designs blending native spirals with imperial eagles. On a Nile barge, a Greek scribe translated Egyptian myths into Latin for his Roman patron. The world grew smaller with each passing year, its edges stitched together by trade and treaties. But empires, like all living things, must adapt or wither. The same roads that carried spices could carry plague. The same legions that kept peace might one day turn their swords on each other. The provinces were Rome's strength, and its vulnerability, stretched like silk over a frame too wide to mend. Sleep wraps around these distant exchanges, the quiet commerce of ideas and olive oil, of laws and laughter. The empire dreams in 100 tongues tonight, each whisper part of a greater story. Rest now, while the world still turns to Rome's rhythm. Tomorrow's dawn will bring new caravans, new words, new threads to weave into the tapestry. The story continues. The empire, like all great things, was not impervious to time. The first signs of strain were subtle, a hairline fracture in marble, a whisper of discontent beneath the hum of daily life. Rome had weathered crises before, but now the challenges came not as singular blows, but as slow tides, lapping at the foundations with patient persistence. In the Senate, the debates grew longer, the voices sharper. Where once the patricians had spoken with measured rhetoric, now factions formed like cracks in drying clay. Some clung to tradition, invoking the ghosts of Cato and Cicero, while others whispered of reform, their eyes on the restless streets beyond the curia's doors. The treasury, once overflowing with the spoils of conquest, now required careful balancing. The cost of legions and public games weighed against dwindling silver from Iberian mines. Taxes that had been bearable became burdens, and the provinces murmured under the weight. Even the streets of Rome, so vibrant in their golden age, bore quiet signs of strain. The aqueducts still flowed, but here and there a fountain ran dry for lack of repairs. The grain dole lines stretched longer on market days, and the faces of the plebs grew leaner in the flicker of oil lamps. In the Subura, where laughter had once spilled from taverns, now arguments flared over stolen loaves or unpaid debts. The city's pulse, once steady as a drumbeat, now faltered, a missed step here, a hesitation there. Beyond the city, the roads still carried their traffic, but the legions who patrolled them were spread thin. A century might guard a stretch of the Danube 1 month, only to be hastily redeployed to quell unrest in Numidia the next. The soldiers, once proud bearers of the Eagle standard, now grumbled over delayed pay and the endless cycle of drills and marches. Their loyalty, once as solid as the shields they carried, began to waver, not in open rebellion, but in the quiet erosion of trust. And yet, life continued. The baker still kneaded his dough at dawn. The senator still reclined at his evening feast. The cracks were there, but they were easy to overlook, like the faintest flaw in a mosaic seen from a distance. Rome had endured civil wars and invasions before. Surely this too would pass. But empires do not fall in a day. The first cracks are silent things, noticed only by those who know where to look. A merchant counting coins with a frown, a soldier sharpening his sword with a little less pride, a mother soothing her child with stories of better times. These were the signs, soft as the first whispers of wind before a storm. Sleep wraps around the city as it wraps around you. The story is not one of sudden ruin, but of slow turning, like the pages of a well-worn scroll. Rest now, while the world still holds its breath. Tomorrow will come, as it always does, but the cracks, once formed, do not heal. The story continues. The markets still bustled, the baths still steamed, but beneath the surface, Rome's golden rhythm had begun to falter. The denarius, once a coin of solid silver, now passed from palm to palm with less weight, its edges dulled by base metals, its value shrinking like a drying stream. Merchants squinted at the emperor's fading profile before accepting it, their fingers quick to hoard the older, purer coins beneath their counters. A loaf of bread cost twice what it had a decade ago, and the murmurs in the grain lines grew sharper, edged with hunger. In the countryside, the fields still yielded wheat and olives, but the harvests were no longer abundant. Small farms, strangled by taxes, folded into the vast estates of the wealthy, their owners drifting to the city in search of bread and spectacle. The latifundia sprawled across the land, worked by chains of slaves whose backs bent under the sun. The soil, overworked and weary, began to lose its vigor, as if even the earth sensed the strain. Beyond the frontiers, the world stirred. Germanic tribes, once content to trade amber for Roman wine, now gathered in larger bands along the Rhine. Their scouts moved like shadows at the edge of the forest, watching the legions drill, counting the watchtowers. The Parthians, too, tested the eastern borders, their cavalry skirmishing with auxiliaries in the dust of Mesopotamia. These were not yet invasions, only probes, fingers testing the strength of a wall. But the legions, stretched thin from Britannia to Syria, could not be everywhere at once. In Rome itself, the emperors came and went with unsettling speed. Some ruled wisely, reforming taxes or repairing roads, but their reigns were often cut short. By assassination, by fever, by the whims of the Praetorian Guard. The Senate, once the steady hand of the Republic, now bowed to whoever held the army's loyalty. Stability, that pillar of Rome's greatness, had become as fragile as a moth's wing. Yet life persisted. The festivals still brightened the calendar, the poets still composed their verses. In the shadow of the Pantheon, a philosopher taught his students that all empires face trials. that Rome, like a man, must endure seasons of leanness to appreciate seasons of plenty. The people listened, nodded, and turned back to their daily struggles, their faith in the eternal city unbroken but quietly fraying. And so the cracks deepened, not with a crash, but with the quiet inevitability of time. A merchant's ledger showed more red than black. A soldier's pay arrived late, then not at all. A child asked why the statues in the Forum wore beards now, when the old ones had been clean-shaven. Small things, fleeting things, but together they were the whispers of change. Sleep wraps around the empire as it wraps around you. The story is not one of abrupt endings, but of slow transformations, like the turning of seasons. Rest now, while the world still turns toward dawn. Tomorrow will come, and with it the resilience of Rome. The story continues. The imperial palace stood silent in the pre-dawn gloom, its marble halls hushed but for the whisper of sandals on mosaic floors. The Emperor Aurelian stirred before the first light, his chamber lit by a single oil lamp that painted shadows across the maps unfurled on his desk. Maps marked with red ink where the frontiers bled. To rule Rome was to balance the weight of the world on one's shoulders. Each morning brought dispatches from provinces he would never see. Reports of grain shortages in Africa, of Saxon raiders testing the Britannic coasts, of Persian envoys demanding concessions beyond the Euphrates. His advisors spoke in measured tones, but their eyes betrayed the truth. The empire was a vast, restless beast, and its reins grew harder to hold. Yet Aurelian moved with deliberate calm. He had been a soldier before the purple draped his shoulders, and he knew the value of steady hands. In the courtyard, he practiced the sword drills of his youth, the blade's edge catching the pale light as it arced through the air. Discipline had forged the legions. Discipline would preserve them. His reforms were methodical, restoring the silver to the denarius, tightening the patrols along the Danube, rebuilding the walls of Rome itself. Stone by stone, law by law, he sought to mend what others had let fray. But even iron bends under enough pressure. In the quiet hours, when the petitioners and secretaries had withdrawn, the weight pressed in. The treasury was a sieve, drained by endless wars and the hunger of the mob for bread and circuses. The Senate, once a council of elders, now hesitated between loyalty and self-preservation, their votes swaying with the mood of the legions. And the legions themselves, oh, the legions. Their loyalty was the empire's backbone, but it came at a price. Land for veterans, bonuses for victories, the thunder of their acclaim that could make or unmake an emperor in a day. Beyond the palace windows, the city began to wake. The bakers' ovens glowed like distant stars. The first carts rumbled over the cobbles toward the markets. Aurelian watched a flock of starlings wheel above the rooftops, their formation shifting effortlessly as if guided by an unseen hand. Rome had once moved with such unity, senators and slaves, patricians and plebs, all bound by the same rhythms. Now the threads were loosening, and no amount of imperial decree could weave them back as tightly as before. A slave entered with a tray of figs and barley water, his gaze lowered. The emperor ate without tasting, his mind already turning to the morning's audiences. A delegation from Alexandria, pleading for tax relief. A general fresh from the Rhine frontier with news of a new tribal confederation. The work was endless, the solutions fleeting. But this was the burden he had accepted. To rule was to serve, not the whims of the mob or the greed of the legions, but the idea of Rome itself. The roads, the laws, the peace that had spanned continents, these were worth the wait. A breeze stirred the parchment on his desk, carrying the scent of cypress from the gardens. Somewhere beyond the walls, a child laughed, high and bright as a flute's note. The empire endured, not because its rulers were gods, but because they were men. Men who rose each dawn and tried again. Sleep lingers at the edges of this vision, where power and fragility meet. Let it carry you, as steady as an emperor's resolve, as quiet as the hour before the world wakes. The story is not over. Rest now. The emperors who followed Aurelian wore the purple with varying degrees of weariness and resolve. Some were scholars, their fingers more accustomed to scrolls than swords. Others were soldiers, their faces still bearing the scars of frontier battles. But all shared the same burden, the crushing weight of an empire that demanded everything and gave little in return. Diocletian, the son of a Dalmatian freedman, understood the cost of power better than most. He had risen through the legions, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of war. When the senator claimed him emperor, he did not celebrate. Instead, he walked the palace halls at night, tracing the cracks in the marble with his fingertips, as if measuring the fractures in the empire itself. His solution was division. The world had grown too vast for one man to rule, so he split it like a loaf of bread, appointing Maximian to govern the west while he held the east. 2 Augusti, 2 courts, 2 sets of eyes scanning the horizon for threats. Later, he added Caesars, junior emperors, to share the load. It was a practical answer, one that acknowledged the truth. Rome could no longer be sustained by a single pair of hands. Yet even division had its price. The Tetrarchy's unity depended on loyalty, and loyalty was a fickle thing. In the provinces, governors whispered that the empire was no longer whole, that the old glory had been carved into quarters like a conquered kingdom. The legions, once bound to a single emperor, now debated which ruler deserved their allegiance. And the people, the weary, tax-burdened people, wondered if 4 courts meant 4 times the hunger, 4 times the strife. In the quiet of his retirement palace at Split, Diocletian tended his cabbages, his hands black with soil. The weight had been lifted, but the marks remained. Letters still arrived from his successors, pleading for advice, for intervention. He read them by the light of an olive oil lamp, then tossed them into the hearth. Let the next generation bear the burden. He had given enough. Back in Rome, the Senate convened in half-empty chambers. The real power now lay wherever the emperors chose to station their courts: Milan, Trier, Nicomedia. The curia's marble seats gathered dust, its debates reduced to echoes. A few old patricians still came, more out of habit than hope, their speeches met with polite indifference. The world had moved on, and the heart of the empire beat faintly, like a pulse beneath layers of wool. Yet in the streets, life persisted. A baker's son played with a wooden sword, pretending to be Aurelian, driving back the Goths. A widow left offerings at a shrine to Isis, her prayers blending Egyptian and Latin into a single plea for mercy. The empire was changing, but its people adapted as they always had, finding solace in small rituals, in the certainty of sunrise and the price of bread. The emperors, for all their power, could not stop time. They could only try to steer its flow, like sailors guiding a ship through narrowing straits. Some would be remembered for their reforms, others for their failures. But all would know the weight, the crushing, sacred weight of holding up the sky. Sleep wraps around them now, as it wraps around you. The story is not one of defeat, but of endurance, of men who bore the world's heaviest crown and still rose each morning to meet the dawn. Rest while the empire dreams on. The story continues, beyond the Rhine, where the forests grew thick and the mist clung to the riverbanks like a shroud. The world stirred. The Germanic tribes had long watched Rome's borders, not with the aimless curiosity of barbarians, but with the patience of wolves circling a fire's edge. Their scouts moved silently along the tree line, noting the thinning garrisons, the rust creeping into the iron of the frontier forts. In the legion camps along the Danube, the sentries tightened their grip on their spears as the autumn winds carried strange echoes. The distant clash of steel, the low hum of war chants. The auxiliaries, many of them drawn from these very tribes, exchanged glances but held their posts. Their loyalty had been bought with coin and land, yet blood ran deeper than treaties. A Frankish warrior might wear a Roman cloak by day, but at night around the fire he still sang the old songs of his people. Rome had faced invaders before. The Cimbri and Teutones had been crushed by Marius's legions. The Marcomanni had been pushed back by Marcus Aurelius. But this time, the threats did not come as a single wave. They seeped in, small bands of raiders testing the limes, slipping through gaps in the watchtowers like smoke. A village burned here, a tax collector vanished there. The legions would march out, scatter the attackers, and return to their forts, only to hear of fresh unrest a week later. It was a war of shadows, of patience, of erosion. In the imperial court, the reports were read with measured concern. emperors dispatched envoys to negotiate with tribal kings, offering gold for peace, titles for allegiance. Some chieftains accepted, their halls filling with Roman wine and their sons sent to serve as hostages, or, as Rome preferred to call them, honored guests. Others spat at the envoys' feet and spoke of prophecies, of a great tide that would one day sweep the legions into the sea. And then there were the Huns. Rumors slithered down the trade routes from the east, carried by wide-eyed merchants and deserters. A people who rode as if born in the saddle, who drank mare's milk and filed their teeth to points. They had shattered the Alans, sent the Goths fleeing westward like leaves before a storm. They did not raid, they devoured. Rome's spies whispered of entire villages abandoned at their approach, of fields left fallow rather than face the horsemen's arrows. Yet within the empire, life persisted. The farmers along the frontiers still tilled their fields, though they kept swords near the plough. The legions still drilled, though their ranks were thinner, their recruits younger. And the cities, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome itself, still shone like beacons, their people clinging to the old rhythms of market and bathhouse, as if the world beyond the walls had not begun to shift. But the shadows lengthened. In the governor's palace at Trier, a map lay spread across a table, its edges weighted with cups of sour wine. The pins marking the legion's positions were outnumbered by the blank spaces between them, stretches of road and river where no patrols walked, where the only law was the wind in the grass. Sleep wraps around these borders as it wraps around you. The story is not one of sudden ruin, but of slow, silent pressure, like the roots of a tree-splitting stone. Rest now while the sentries keep their watch. Tomorrow's dawn may bring new tidings, or merely the same unease, lingering like a chill in the air. The slow encroachment of invasions was not heralded by trumpets or the thunder of hooves, but by whispers. Merchants speaking of abandoned villages beyond the Rhine, shepherds finding their flocks scattered by strangers in the night. Like a distant murmur carried on the wind, the threats grew clearer, though Rome's heart still beat steadily, unaware of how close the shadows had crept. Along the northern frontiers, the watchtowers stood as they had for centuries, their signal fires ready to flare at the first sign of movement. But the soldiers who manned them were no longer the iron-clad legionaries of old. Many were local recruits, sons of frontier farmers who spoke Latin with the cadence of their tribal tongues. They peered into the forests, straining to distinguish between the rustle of leaves and the footfalls of men. Sometimes they saw nothing. Other times, the glint of spear tips flickered between the trees, there and gone like fireflies in the dusk. The Goths came first, not as a unified force, but in scattered bands, driven from their lands by the relentless advance of the Huns. They arrived at the Danube's edge, gaunt and desperate, pleading for shelter within the empire's borders. Roman officials, weighing mercy against caution, allowed some to cross, disarmed, dispersed, and sworn to service. But hunger and broken promises soon turned supplicants into rebels. A chieftain named Fritigern raised his banner, and the scattered whispers became a chorus of clashing steel. At Adrianople, the legions marched out to meet the Goths under the white-hot sun of summer. The battle should have been a swift restoration of order. Instead, the Roman lines buckled, their cavalry outmaneuvered, their emperor lying lifeless in the dust. The survivors stumbled back to the city gates, their shields splintered, their voices hollow with shock. The unthinkable had happened. Barbarians had broken a Roman army in open battle. Yet even this was not the end. Rome had suffered defeats before and risen stronger. New emperors took the throne. Theodosius, a Spaniard with a soldier's bearing and a diplomat's tongue. He negotiated, cajoled, and when necessary, fought. The Goths were granted lands and titles, folded into the empire's fabric as foederati, bound by treaty to defend the very borders they had once threatened. It was a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. Meanwhile, the Huns drew nearer. Their scouts ranged along the edges of the empire, testing defenses, probing for weakness. They did not send envoys or make demands. Their silence was more terrifying than any declaration of war. The tribes who had once stood between Rome and the steppes were gone, absorbed, annihilated, or fleeing westward in a desperate tide. The roads that had carried grain and marble now carried refugees, their carts laden with belongings, their faces etched with exhaustion. In Rome, life continued with stubborn normalcy. Senators debated in the Curia, though their words carried less weight than before. The Colosseum still roared with crowds, though the beasts in the arena were scarcer, the games less lavish. The people grumbled about taxes and bread prices, but the true danger felt distant, abstract, a storm beyond the horizon, its thunder muffled by the Alps. But the storm was coming. The gates still stood, the legions still answered the call, yet each year the shadows grew bolder. A merchant's tale of a burned-out villa here, a missing patrol there. These were the stitches unraveling at the empire's edges. Sleep wraps around these borders now, as it wraps around you. The murmurs of invasion are soft, like the rustle of leaves before a gust of wind. Rest, while the sentries keep their watch. The story is not over. Empires bend before they break, and Rome has weathered storms before. Tomorrow will come, as it always does. But the shadows, once fleeting, now linger. The story continues. The roads that had once pulsed with imperial messengers and trade caravans now lay quiet in stretches, their stones loosened by neglect. The aqueducts still carried water to Rome's heart, but their arches bore the scars of makeshift repairs, patches of mismatched brick where marble had once gleamed. The empire's veins were weakening, its lifeblood thinning with each passing season. In the markets, the denarius changed hands with reluctance. Once a coin of pure silver, it had been debased over generations, its value fading like the afternoon light. Merchants weighed purses with furrowed brows, calculating not just the number of coins, but their worth. A baker might demand 5 denarii for a loaf that once cost 2, his fingers drumming on the counter as he eyed the crowd. The treasury, drained by wars and the ceaseless hunger of the dole, could no longer mint coins as it had in the days of Augustus. The empire ran on fumes of former prosperity. The great estates of the countryside, the latifundia that had fed Rome's millions, now struggled under their own weight. Slave revolts and barbarian raids had left fields untended, their crops withering under the sun. The soil, overworked and exhausted, yielded less each harvest. In the shadow of empty granaries, officials rationed grain shipments, turning away the hungry with empty hands. The plebs murmured in the streets, their loyalty fraying like the hems of their tunics. Rome's bureaucracy, once a marvel of efficiency, now groaned under its own complexity. Tax collectors ventured into provinces only to return empty-handed, their ledgers marked with debts that would never be paid. Governors wrote desperate pleas to the emperor, their scrolls filled with accounts of bandits on the roads and villages abandoned to the wilds. The imperial post, that swift relay of messengers, slowed to a crawl as way stations fell into disrepair. An edict from Ravenna might take months to reach Hispania, if it arrived at all. Yet in the twilight of the empire, innovation flickered like a candle in the wind. Engineers devised smaller, sturdier bridges to replace the soaring arches of old, their designs pragmatic rather than grand. Local militias, no longer able to rely on distant legions, took up the defense of their own towns, forging swords from broken plows. The wealthy retreated to their fortified villas, their courtyards no longer open to the public gaze, but shuttered against the world. And still the city endured. The baths of Diocletian steamed as they always had, though the mosaics were cracked in places. The forum still echoed with the footsteps of senators, though their debates were whispers compared to the thunderous orations of Cicero's day. Children still played in the shadow of the Colosseum, their games unchanged even as the empire shifted beneath their feet. But the cracks were no longer hairline. They gaped like wounds, visible to any who cared to look. The world beyond the walls grew louder, tribes gathering, borders trembling, while within, the machinery of empire rusted in silence. Sleep wraps around these fading streets as it wraps around you. The story is not one of sudden darkness, but of dusk. Slow, inevitable, and flecked with stubborn light. Rest now while the city still dreams. Tomorrow's dawn may be softer, but it will come. The quiet transformation of Roman society unfolded like the changing of seasons. Subtle, inevitable, noticed only in hindsight. The old gods still stood in their temples, but their altars gathered dust as new beliefs took root in the empire's soil. In dimly lit rooms, followers of Christ whispered prayers over simple meals, their faith unshaken by the distant rumble of falling statues. The philosophers' lecture halls, once filled with debates on Plato and Seneca, now echoed with discussions of salvation and the soul. Rome did not abandon its past, it merely made room for what came next. In the homes of the wealthy, mosaics of Bacchus and Venus gave way to symbols of fish and anchors, artfully concealed beneath floorboards when officials came to call. A patrician woman might wear both a cross and her grandmother's amulet of Juno, hedging her bets against an uncertain world. The old rituals persisted. The Lupercalia's laughter still rang through the streets in February. The Vestals tended their flame, but the heart of worship had shifted. The empire, once bound by Jupiter's thunder, now sought solace in a carpenter's promise of peace. The fabric of daily life frayed at the edges. The public schools, once the pride of Roman towns, closed their doors as tutors retreated to private villas. Sons of merchants learned arithmetic from their fathers instead of Greek pedagogues. Daughters memorized psalms rather than Ovid's verses. The great libraries stood untouched, their scrolls brittle with age, as fewer hands reached for wisdom and more for bread. Yet in the shadow of this retreat, new traditions bloomed. Monks in distant monasteries copied not only scripture, but the works of Virgil and Cicero, their quills preserving the old world even as they heralded the new. The legions, too, wore unfamiliar faces. Gone were the clean-shaven soldiers of the Trajanic columns. Now bearded Goths and Franks stood shoulder to shoulder with Romans, their loyalty sworn to individual generals rather than the distant ideal of empire. They fought under the eagle still, but their war cries carried the cadence of northern forests. The armor they wore was simpler, their tactics rougher, yet they held the frontiers with a fierceness that bureaucracy alone could no longer muster. In the markets, the lingua franca shifted. Latin endured, but it mingled freely with Greek, with Syriac, with the guttural rhythms of Germanic tongues. A trader might haggle in 3 languages before noon, his speech a living testament to the empire's slow metamorphosis. The toga, that symbol of Romanitas, became a relic, replaced by the practical trousers and tunics of the provinces. Even the food changed. Where once gourds and dormice graced patrician tables, now hearty stews and barley bread fed high and low alike. Yet for all this quiet revolution, the essence of Rome persisted. The law, though strained, still promised justice to citizen and foreigner. The roads, though cracked, still carried travelers from one corner of the empire to another. And the people, the weary, hopeful, stubborn people, still called themselves Roman, even as the world around them reshaped what that meant. The light was fading, but it had not vanished. In the glow of a single lamp, a scholar copied Livy's histories, his hand steady despite the chaos beyond his door. A midwife sang an old lullaby as she delivered a child into a changing world. A farmer planted his field, trusting the earth to yield as it always had. Sleep wraps around this twilight empire as it wraps around you. The story is not one of endings, but of quiet evolution, like a river altering its course grain by grain. Rest now, while the world still turns beneath the same stars that once watched over Romulus. Tomorrow will dawn, different yet familiar. The story continues. The Western Empire, in its twilight, was ruled by men who wore the purple like a borrowed cloak, ill-fitting and heavy with the weight of unraveling realms. They were not the philosopher kings of Marcus Aurelius's time, nor the iron generals like Trajan. They were survivors, stepping onto a stage already crumbling beneath their feet. Honorius, the boy emperor, had spent his reign behind the high walls of Ravenna, far from the barbarian tides lapping at Italy's edges. His court was a gilded cage where eunuchs and advisors whispered policy while he fed grapes to his pet chickens. When news arrived that Rome had been sacked by the Visigoths in 410 AD, he reportedly cried out for his beloved bird Roma, before realizing they spoke of the city. The empire had become an abstraction to its own ruler, a fading fresco glimpsed through layers of silk curtains. Yet not all was paralysis. In the provinces, men of sterner metal tried to shore up the fragments. Stilicho, the half-Vandal general, had held the West together through sheer will. His legions a patchwork of Romans and Federati. He understood the new truth. Rome's survival depended on bending, not breaking. But the court feared his ambition, and in the end they executed him, severing their strongest limb to spite their own body. The emperors who followed were ghosts of the past. Avitus, a Gallic aristocrat propped up by Visigothic allies, lasted barely a year before being deposed by his own soldiers. Majorian, the last with any vision, tried to restore the old laws and rebuild the legions, only to be betrayed by a corrupt advisor who sold his plans to the Vandals. His death warrant was signed with the same ink that had once ratified treaties with Parthia. In the streets of Rome, the people adapted. The Senate still met, though its decrees carried little beyond the city walls. The grain dole had long since vanished, replaced by small plots where citizens grew vegetables between the ruins of temples. The wealthy fled to their country estates, turning villas into fortresses, their mosaic floors now trod by armed retainers speaking broken Latin. And yet, life persisted. The baths of Caracalla still steamed, though the pipes groaned and the statues lacked their gilding. The Colosseum hosted not gladiators, but makeshift markets, its arches sheltering cobblers and spice sellers. Children played emperor and barbarian in the Forum, their shouts echoing off empty pedestals where bronze emperors had once stood. The East watched, but did not intervene. Constantinople, richer and safer behind its triple walls, sent occasional gold to prop up its twin, but no armies. The message was clear. The West must save itself, or fall trying. Sleep wraps around these final emperors as it wraps around you. Their reigns were short, their power brittle, but they clung to the title of Augustus like a raft in a storm. Rest now, while the Tiber still flows toward the sea. The story is not over. Even endings take time. The final act of the Western Empire unfolded not with a clash of swords, but with the quiet rustle of parchment. In 476 AD, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus sat upon a throne that no longer commanded obedience beyond the hills of Italy. His name echoed Rome's mythic founders, Romulus and Augustus, yet he ruled only in shadow, a figurehead for the Germanic general Odoacer who held true power. The surrender of imperial authority was a bloodless affair. There were no burning cities, no last stand at the gates. Odoacer, a soldier of pragmatic mind, simply declared himself king of Italy and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople with a courteous letter. The East, after all, still claimed sovereignty over the whole empire. The West, exhausted and fractured, accepted the change with weary resignation. The Senate, its ranks thinned but still assembled, acknowledged the new order without protest. Rome had not fallen. It had sighed and laid down its burden. In the streets, life adjusted to the absence of an emperor. The baker still rose before dawn to knead his dough. The mason repaired the walls of a patrician's villa, his trowel smoothing cracks older than his grandfather. The rhythms of the city continued, though the hand that guided them now bore a different name. Odoacer ruled as a steward rather than a conqueror, preserving Roman law and customs even as the old titles faded. The people, long accustomed to distant and fleeting rulers, found little reason to mourn. Beyond Italy, the provinces had already slipped away. Gaul was a patchwork of Frankish and Burgundian kingdoms, its Roman aristocracy blending with the new elite through marriage and mutual interest. Hispania bowed to Visigothic kings who minted coins bearing the likeness of long-dead emperors, a nod to continuity amidst change. North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket, thrived under Vandal rule, its ports bustling with trade, even as its churches debated theology with a fervor that would have baffled the old pagan Senate. Yet Rome's light did not vanish. The Senate, though stripped of power, continued to meet in the Curia Julia, its debates now limited to local matters. The great families still traced their lineage to the Republic's heroes, their bloodlines a living archive of the past. Latin endured in law and liturgy, its grammar unbroken even as new words seeped in from Germanic and Celtic tongues. The roads, though pitted with age, still carried travelers, merchants, pilgrims, scholars, each step a testament to the empire's enduring skeleton. and in the east, Constantinople stood unwavering. The Emperor Zeno received Odoacer's envoys with measured grace, accepting the Western regalia as one might store away a relic, not discarded, but set aside for another season. The Eastern Empire would endure for centuries more, its scholars preserving Plato and Cicero even as its armies held back Persians and Avars. Rome had not fallen, it had merely folded in upon itself, like a parchment map too worn to unfold fully. On the Palatine Hill, the imperial palace stood empty, its halls echoing with the footsteps of caretakers rather than courtiers. Weeds sprouted between the flagstones of the Forum, and the bronze doors of the Temple of Jupiter bore the scratches of time. Yet the Pantheon's dome still pierced the sky, and the Tiber still curled around the city like a sleeping serpent. The people of Rome, though no longer citizens of an empire, carried its legacy in their speech, their laws, their very bones. Sleep wraps around this quiet transition, as it wraps around you. The story is not one of endings, but of transformations. Like a river delta branching into new streams, each carrying fragments of the same ancient source. Rest now while the world turns toward dawn. The empire is gone, the legacy remains. The fall of Rome was not an ending, but a slow dispersal, like embers from a dying fire, each carrying the potential to ignite something new. Though the Western Empire had ceased to be, its essence lingered in the stones of cities, the words of laws, the quiet habits of daily life. The world did not forget Rome, it absorbed it, piece by piece, breath by breath. In the countryside, the villas of the wealthy still stood, though their owners had changed. A Frankish chieftain might dine beneath frescoes of Bacchus, his rough hands tracing the faded pigments as his children learned Latin from a captured tutor. The baths, though no longer maintained by imperial coffers, were still used, their warm waters now blessed by Christian priests, their statues of nymphs draped modestly with cloth. The roads, though cracked and overgrown in places, remained the arteries of Europe, trodden by pilgrims and merchants who knew nothing of the engineers who had laid them centuries before. The church became the new guardian of Rome's legacy. Monasteries rose along forgotten roads, their scriptoria preserving not just scripture, but the works of Virgil, Cicero, and Pliny. A monk in a damp Irish cell might painstakingly copy the Aeneid between psalms, his quill preserving the epic alongside tales of saints. The Latin Mass echoed in basilicas built from repurposed temples, the old gods' marble faces peering down from the shadows as new prayers filled the air. Law, too, endured. The Visigothic code of King Euric borrowed heavily from Roman jurisprudence, as did the edicts of Frankish kings. In the East, Justinian's scholars compiled the Corpus Juris Civilis, distilling centuries of imperial decrees into a system that would shape Europe for 1,000 years. The idea that a ruler was bound by law, not above it, outlived the emperors who had once embodied it. Even in small things, Rome persisted. The wine presses of Gaul still used techniques perfected on Italian estates. The glass blowers of Cologne crafted goblets in styles unchanged since Augustus's reign. A farmer in Britannia might measure his field in Jugera, long after the surveyors who had marked the land were dust. The empire had receded, but its imprint remained, subtle, stubborn, like the scent of olive oil lingering in an empty amphora. And the people, oh, the people. They still called themselves Romans in places like Ravenna and Marseille, long after the last emperor had vanished. Their Latin fractured into dialects that would become French, Spanish, Portuguese, each a love letter to the mother tongue. They baked bread with millstones shaped like their ancestors, told stories of Trojan heroes and martyred saints, and laid their dead to rest under epitaphs that still began, dis manibus, to the spirits of the departed. Sleep wraps around these quiet continuities as it wraps around you. The story is not one of loss, but of transformation, like a river that sinks underground only to resurface miles away, unchanged in essence, though altered in course. Rest now, while the past whispers to the present. The light has not faded, it has only changed hands. Rome's influence lingered like the last notes of a fading song, soft but unmistakable, woven into the fabric of the world that followed. In art, language, and law, the empire's fingerprints remained, guiding hands across centuries. The arches and columns of Roman architecture rose again in Renaissance palaces and neoclassical courthouses. Michelangelo studied the Pantheon's dome before designing St. Peter's. Thomas Jefferson echoed the proportions of the Maison Carrée in his Virginia state capitol. Even the humble basilica, once a Roman hall of justice, became the blueprint for Christian churches, its nave and aisles repurposed for worship rather than governance. Latin, the tongue of Virgil and Cicero, never truly died. It thrived in the cloisters of monks, the laboratories of scientists, the courtrooms of kings. Every etc. murmured by a tired scholar, every habeas corpus invoked by a judge, carried the echo of the forum's orators. The Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, bloomed from its roots like branches from an ancient oak, their grammar and vocabulary still bearing the shape of Rome's thought. The law's legacy proved most enduring. The concept of innocent until proven guilty, the rights of property and contract, even the very idea of a codified legal system, all flowed from Roman jurists whose names were forgotten but whose principles endured. When Napoleon commissioned his civil code, he reached back to Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, bridging 15 centuries with a single legal thread. In the quiet corners of daily life, Rome persisted. The calendar still followed Caesar's reforms. The names of July and August honored emperors long turned to dust. The recipes for garum vanished, but the Mediterranean diet, olives, wheat, wine, remained unchanged. A child tracing the letters of the alphabet, a mason laying bricks in alternating courses, a farmer rotating crops between fields, all unknowingly paid homage to Rome's quiet genius. And so the empire lived on, not in borders or crowns, but in the unbroken chain of human endeavor. The sunset over the Forum might have marked an ending, but its light still gilds the world today. Sleep now, cradled by this legacy. The story is done, but its echoes never fade. The sun sets over Rome, not with a crash of falling marble or the wail of mourning crowds, but softly, like a sigh at the end of a long day. The light lingers on the Pantheon's dome, gilding its oculus one last time before slipping away. The Tiber, which once reflected the fires of conquest, now mirrors only the quiet stars. Empires, like all living things, have their seasons. Rome's was long and luminous, a golden age that stretched from the muddy banks of the Tiber to the marble halls of Constantinople. It built roads that outlasted their builders, laws that transcended their makers, and ideas that refused to fade even when the legions did. The fall was not a single moment, but a slow turning. The Western Empire dissolved like salt in water, its power dispersing into kingdoms that still carried its name like an heirloom. The East endured, a torch passed to Byzantine hands, flickering for 1,000 years more. Rome did not vanish, it transformed, its Latin fracturing into new tongues, its eagles nesting in foreign banners, its stones repurposed into churches and fortresses. And yet, walk the Appian Way at dusk, and you might still hear the echo of marching boots. Trace your fingers over a medieval manuscript, and you'll find Cicero's words preserved beneath the saints' hymns. Stand beneath the dome of the Capitol in Washington or the arches of Paris, and you'll see Rome's ghost in every column. The empire fell, but its light was never extinguished, only scattered like embers carried on the wind to kindle new fires. So let us say farewell, as Rome itself might have, not with grief, but with gratitude. The sun has set, but its afterglow lingers in the west, painting the clouds in gold and purple. The story is done, but its echoes remain in the laws we uphold, the words we speak, the roads we still walk. Close your eyes now. Let the quiet tide of history carry you back to the present, where Rome lives on in all that it gave the world. Sleep while the stars turn over the eternal city one more time. The story of Rome has been told, not with the clamor of battle or the weight of scholarly debate, but softly as a whisper before sleep. We have walked its sunlit streets and shadowed corridors, traced the rise and fall of its emperors, and lingered in the quiet persistence of its legacy. Now, as the last echoes of history fade, we offer our gratitude to you who have listened, who have let these words carry you across centuries. Rome was built not only by the hands of legionaries and architects, but by the memories of those who kept its story alive. In that tradition, we pass it to you, a gentle inheritance of marble and moonlight. If these tales have eased your mind, if the murmur of the past has lulled you toward rest, then we have done our part. The world is full of stories waiting to be told softly, and perhaps we will return to share them with you another night. For now, let the silence settle around you like twilight over the forum. The emperors sleep, the legions stand down, and the great wheel of history turns without a sound. As the echoes of Rome fade into the quiet of night, we invite you to drift deeper into history's embrace. If these whispered tales have carried you gently through the rise and fall of empires, consider joining us again. There are more stories to be told, softer, slower, woven just for restful minds. Subscribe and let the past cradle you anew. The library of dreams is vast, and every scroll holds another lullaby. For now, let sleep take you. The emperors have had their say, the legions their march, but other voices remain, softer, sweeter, waiting in the wings. Until next time, dear listener, good night.